The heavy oak doors of the Providence Community Church boomed shut, the sound a final, unholy punctuation to her life. The noise echoed down the empty street, swallowed by the oppressive silence of the falling snow. One moment she was enveloped in the scent of candle wax and the suffocating judgment of her neighbors. The next, the world was nothing but the bite of a winter wind that clawed through her thin wool dress and the vast, unforgiving white of the Montana Territory stretching out before her. Alara Vance stood on the church steps, a ghost in her own town. Her hand, trembling, clutched the pathetic weight of a small coin pouch in her pocket. It felt colder than the metal itself. Just moments before, she had been sitting in the front pew, the wood hard and unyielding against her back. The entire town of Providence was there, their faces a gallery of grim curiosity, feigned pity, and righteous scorn. They were there for the Sunday sermon, but more than that, they were there for the spectacle. They were there to watch the preacher's daughter burn. Her father, the Reverend Theron Vance, stood at the pulpit, a titan of piety in his black frock coat. He was not a man of gentle forgiveness. He was a craftsman of fear, and his voice was his sharpest tool. "Sin!" he thundered, his knuckles white where he gripped the lectern. The word ricocheted off the cold stone walls. "It is a serpent, a viper that slithers into the most sacred of gardens, into the heart of our very homes." He did not look at her, but she felt his gaze like a physical weight. Every eye in the church was on her, on the slight but undeniable swell of her belly beneath the drab fabric of her dress. They had been whispering for weeks, their words like swarming insects. Now her father was giving those whispers a voice of divine authority. "And when that serpent sinks its fangs into the flesh of one of our own," he continued, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial hiss that drew the congregation in, "when a vessel of God's grace, a vessel we have nurtured and cherished, allows itself to be sullied by base, carnal rot, what is our duty? Do we coddle it? Do we hide the wound and pretend the venom is not spreading?" He paused, letting the question hang in the thick, still air. "No! We must be the surgeons of the soul. We must take up the righteous blade and cut out the corruption before it poisons us all." A murmur of assent rippled through the pews. Alara felt her breath catch in her throat. She could see Mrs. Gable, who had taught her needlepoint, nodding grimly. She saw Mr. Hemlock, the blacksmith, stroking his beard with a cruel glint in his eye. These were the people who had watched her grow up. Now they were watching her be unmade. She risked a glance at her father. His face was flushed with the ecstasy of his own righteousness. He was enjoying this. This performance of moral purity was the greatest sermon of his life, and she was the prop. The shame he should have felt was absent, replaced by a terrifying, theatrical fury. He was purging his house not of sin, but of the evidence of it. The sermon ended. The final hymn felt like a dirge. As the congregation filed out, they created a wide, deliberate berth around her. No one met her gaze, they were ghosts to her, and she to them. Then he was there, descending from the pulpit, his shadow falling over her long before he reached her. He stopped before her pew and spoke her name, his voice no longer booming, but a low, venomous whisper meant only for her, "Alara." She rose, her legs unsteady. He led her not to the parsonage, their home, but to the front doors of the church. He pushed them open, and the cold air rushed in, a harbinger of her new reality. On the steps, with the snow swirling around their feet, he pressed the small leather pouch into her hand. The coins inside made a dull, pathetic clink. "Your inheritance," he said, the words stripped of all emotion. "You are no longer a Vance. You are no longer welcome in my house or in this town. Leave Providence by sundown. If you ever return, do not expect mercy from me or from God." She looked into his eyes, searching for a flicker of the father who had once read her stories, who had held her hand. She found nothing. There was only the cold, hard certainty of a man who had chosen his reputation over his child. "Father, please," she whispered, the words stolen by the wind. He did not reply. He simply turned his back on her, walked back into the vast empty church, and pulled the heavy doors shut. The boom echoed, a sound of absolute finality. And so she stood, alone, pregnant, and banished, with a handful of coins and a wilderness that promised only a slow, cold death. She took a breath, the frigid air searing her lungs. The shock was beginning to recede, replaced by a terrifying clarity. Her father had cast her out to die. The people of Providence had watched him do it. She had no one. A flicker of defiance, small and fragile, ignited in the frozen depths of her heart. She was her father's daughter in one respect. She was stubborn. She placed a protective hand over her belly. "He will not be the end of us," she whispered to the life within her. "I promise you." With that silent vow, Alara Vance turned her back on the only home she had ever known and took her first step into the unforgiving white. The world beyond Providence was a study in brutal beauty. The snow-laden pines stood like silent, white-robed sentinels, and the mountains sawed at a sky the color of dull pewter. For 3 days Alara walked. The cold was a living thing, a predator that gnawed at her fingers and toes and settled deep in her bones. Her worn leather boots, never intended for such a trek, were soaked through, and each step was a fresh agony of chafing and ice. She rationed her meager funds and the small loaf of bread she'd bought in the next settlement, a place so small it was just a name on a map. There, the stairs were less about judgment and more about a cold, practical assessment of her chances of survival. They weren't good. At night, she found what shelter she could, a shallow cave, the lee of a rock formation, and built small, smoky fires that seemed to generate more fear than warmth. In the dancing shadows, the loneliness was a physical presence. It was then that she would talk to her baby, her voice a low murmur against the sighing of the wind. "Your father, he would have loved this," she'd say, her hand on her stomach. "Nathaniel loved the mountains. He said they made him feel small in a good way, like his worries were small too." Memories of him were all she had left. They came in sharp, painful flashes, the secret smiles they'd exchanged across the church pews, the warmth of his hand closing over hers behind the blacksmith's shop, the smell of hay and sunshine that clung to his clothes. He was a ranch hand, strong and gentle, with eyes that saw her, not the preacher's daughter. He'd been saving his wages, whispering plans of a small plot of land far away from her father's suffocating piety. "He wouldn't have let this happen," she whispered to the flames, a hot tear freezing on her cheek. Nathaniel had disappeared 2 months ago. A note had been left saying he'd found better work in the north. It had broken her heart, but the discovery of her pregnancy a week later had overshadowed the grief with a terrifying new reality. She had believed he abandoned her. Now, trudging through this frozen hell, a darker suspicion began to take root. On the 4th day, half delirious from hunger and cold, she stumbled upon a way station. It was little more than a ramshackle log cabin with a crude sign proclaiming Jeb's Supplies and Saloon. Smoke curled from its stone chimney, a promise of life and warmth that drew her forward like a moth. The moment she pushed open the heavy plank door, a wave of noise and smells washed over her. Stale beer, unwashed bodies, wood smoke, and fried bacon. The handful of patrons, grizzled trappers and weary drifters, paused their conversations to stare. A young, pretty woman, alone and visibly pregnant, was a rare and unsettling sight. The proprietor, a man with a sour face and suspicious eyes, wiped the grimy bar with a dirtier rag. "What you want?" he grunted. "Some stew, please," Alara said, her voice hoarse. And a piece of bread." She slid 2 precious coins onto the bar. He swept them up and ladled a thin, watery stew into a wooden bowl, slapping it down in front of her with a piece of bread that was hard as a rock. She didn't care. She found a small table in the darkest corner and devoured the meager meal, the warmth spreading through her, slowly, painfully. As she ate, she listened. The talk was of the weather, the price of pelts, and a name that came up again and again: Bartholomew Thorne. "Buying up everything from here to the Gray Hills," a trapper with a missing tooth was saying. "Don't matter if you want to sell or not. Thorne gets what he wants." His companion, a younger man, nodded. "Heard his men burned out the millers last month, just for refusing his offer. And they're the ones who deal with anyone who makes trouble." He lowered his voice. "Like that young fella from the Cross T Ranch, near Providence? The foreman told me Thorne's boys paid him a visit, told him to ride on and never look back. Said the boy was getting notions about something or other. Alara froze, the spoon halfway to her lips. The cross T. That was where Nathaniel had worked. A cold dread far worse than the winter wind seeped into her. He wasn't just run off. He was a loose end, a complication. Her father had forbidden her from seeing him. Had his disapproval extended further? Had he mentioned his problem to a man like Thorne, a man who dealt with problems? The sour-faced proprietor, Jeb, seemed to have decided she'd had enough of his charity. You done? Best be moving on. Don't want your kind loitering. Alara didn't have the strength to argue. She pushed herself to her feet, the warmth of the stew already fading, and headed back toward the door, back into the cold. Her personal tragedy was no longer just a story of a broken heart and a shamed daughter. It was beginning to feel like a piece of a much larger, much uglier puzzle. Miles away, hidden in a rocky alcove that offered a commanding view of the valley floor, Silas Sill Kane watched the distant train through a brass spyglass. The locomotive chugged along the newly laid tracks, a black scar on the pristine snow, spewing a plume of gray smoke into the crisp air. He wasn't looking at the passenger cars or the cargo. He was watching the flatbed car near the back, where two men in long coats held rifles, their eyes scanning the landscape. Pinkertons, hired by Thorne. Silas collapsed the spyglass with a practiced snap. His face was a mask of cold patience, etched with lines that spoke of too much sun and too little sleep. His movements were spare and efficient, born of a life where wasted energy could mean death. He was an outlaw, a name that was whispered with a mixture of fear and grudging respect in saloons across the territory. But he was not a common bandit. He was a ghost, a predator hunting a bigger predator. He reached into his worn leather vest and pulled out a photograph, the paper soft and creased from years of handling. It was a faded image of a smiling woman with kind eyes and a small boy on her lap. He stared at it for a long, silent moment, his thumb gently stroking the boy's face. The hard lines around his own eyes softened almost imperceptibly, a flicker of a forgotten life. Then, as quickly as it came, the softness vanished. He tucked the photograph away, the ghosts put back in their pocket, and turned his attention back to the valley. His war with Thorne was patient, personal, and absolute. Later that night, necessity drove him to the same way station Alara had fled. He needed whiskey and cartridges, and Jeb's was the only supplier for 50 miles who didn't ask questions, so long as your coin was good. He tethered his horse in the trees and approached on foot, his hand resting near the butt of his colt. He was 20 yards from the door when he heard the shouting. It was clumsy, panicked shouting. Amateurs. He sighed. Trouble was a magnet, and he was tired of being drawn to it. He pushed the door open and stepped inside. The scene was exactly what he'd expected. 3 grimy bandits, high on desperation, were trying to rob the place. One had a shotgun leveled at Jeb, who was fumbling to open his cash box. Another was waving his pistol at the few terrified patrons huddled in a corner. The third, the biggest and dumbest of the lot, had his back to the door. He was menacing the girl. Silas recognized her instantly, the preacher's daughter from the snowy trail. She was trying to shrink into the wall, her face pale with terror. The bandit grabbed her arm. Well now, what have we here? A little lost lamb. Silas didn't announce himself. He didn't need to. The click of his pistol's hammer being cocked was sound enough. It cut through the room like a crack of doom. The bandit holding Alara turned, his eyes wide. He was too slow. Silas's Colt barked once. A neat, dark hole appeared in the man's forehead, and he collapsed like a sack of grain. The other 2 spun around, firing wildly. Glass shattered. Wood splintered. But Silas was already moving, a fluid shadow. He fired twice more. The shots so close together, they sounded like one. The man with the pistol clutched his chest and fell backward over a table. The one holding the shotgun just dropped it, staring down at the red stain spreading across his shirt before slumping to the floor. It was over in less than 5 seconds. The silence that followed was thick and heavy, smelling of gunpowder and blood. Jeb and the trappers stared at Silas, their faces a mixture of terror and awe. He had not saved them. He had simply removed an obstacle with lethal efficiency. Silas ignored them. He walked to the bar, stepped over a body, and grabbed a bottle of whiskey and a box of cartridges. He turned to leave, his gaze sweeping over the room one last time. It landed on Alara. She was still pressed against the wall, her eyes wide, her hand on her belly. A flicker of something crossed his face, annoyance, perhaps, at the universe's insistence on putting this particular piece of trouble in his path. He said nothing to her. He was at the door when Jeb, the proprietor, finally found his voice, a nasty, shaking whine. "Get out!" he shrieked, pointing a trembling finger at Alara. You brought this on us! Get out!" Silas paused, his back to the room. The injustice of it, the sheer cowardly stupidity of blaming the victim, pricked at a part of him he thought had long since died. With a weary sigh, he spoke, his voice a low, gravelly rasp. "Let the girl stay the night," he said, not looking back. "Put it on my tab." He tossed a silver dollar onto the floor. It spun, flashing in the lantern light, before settling in a pool of spilled beer. Then he was gone, vanishing into the darkness as silently as he had appeared, leaving Alara in a stunned, bloody silence, saved for the second time by a man who was more dangerous than the wilderness itself. Despite Silas's command, Jeb's hospitality had its limits. The next morning, the proprietor made it clear Alara's presence was unwelcome. With a heavy heart, she bought what supplies she could afford, and once again faced the trail, the memory of the previous night's violence a fresh and terrifying brand on her mind. The weather, as if sensing her despair, turned against her. The sky, which had been a clear, cold blue, bruised to a dark gray. Snow began to fall, not in gentle flakes, but in a thick, driving curtain that reduced visibility to a few feet. The wind rose to a mournful howl, and soon she was pushing through a full-blown blizzard. Her strength gave out an hour later. Her body, already weakened by pregnancy and privation, simply refused to go on. She stumbled and fell, crawling behind a large rock formation that offered a pittance of shelter from the wind. The cold was overwhelming, a deep, numbing lethargy that promised the sweet relief of sleep. She knew with a chilling certainty that if she closed her eyes, she would not wake up. This was the end. Her promise to her unborn child had been a fool's hope. Through the shrieking wind, she heard a sound, hoofbeats muffled by the snow. Hope, desperate and irrational, flared within her. A rescue party? Two riders emerged from the white curtain, their figures dark and ominous. They weren't rescuers. Their faces were hard, their eyes predatory. They wore long dusters bearing the unmistakable brand of a T over a spur on their collars. Thorne's men. They hadn't been looking for her, but their cruel luck was her misfortune. One of them, a man with a jagged scar on his cheek, leered down at her. "Well, look what the storm blew in, a little snowbird, all alone." His partner chuckled, a low, ugly sound. "Looks like she's carrying precious cargo, too. Wonder who the lucky father is." Fear, sharp and galvanizing, cut through Alara's frozen lethargy. She pushed herself up, her back against the rock. "Leave me alone!" The scar-faced man dismounted, his boots crunching in the snow. "Now, that ain't very neighborly. We were just thinking of helping you get warm." He reached for her. Alara shrank back, her heart hammering against her ribs. This was a different kind of death, one far more terrifying than the cold. A single sharp crack echoed through the blizzard. It was not thunder. The scar-faced man jerked, a look of surprise on his face, before a red blossom bloomed on his chest, and he pitched forward into the snow. His partner cursed, fumbling for his pistol. Before he could clear the leather, a second shot rang out. He was thrown from his saddle, landing in a heap a few feet away. Silence returned, broken only by the howl of the wind. A figure emerged from the swirling snow, rifle held at the ready. It was Silas Kane. He hadn't been following her. He'd been tracking Thorne's men, a routine he performed with religious dedication. He knew their patrol routes, their habits. Finding Alara in their clutches was a complication, an unwelcome disruption to his solitary war. He strode over to her, his face a mask of grim annoyance. He looked down at her, shivering and helpless in the snow. "You got a real talent for finding trouble, preacher's girl," he said, his voice flat. He must have overheard enough at the way station to piece her story together. You... why? She managed to stammer, her teeth chattering. They work for a man I don't like, he replied, ejecting the spent cartridges from his rifle. You were in the way. Don't read into it. His words were cold, dismissive, but his actions betrayed them. He saw the blue tinge of her lips, the violent shivering that racked her body. He knew she was minutes from freezing to death. With a heavy sigh that seemed to carry the weight of the entire world, he holstered his rifle. Looks like you're my problem for now, he muttered, more to himself than to her. He bent down and with a surprising gentleness lifted her from the snow. Her weight was nothing. He swung her up onto his horse, mounting behind her and wrapping a rough woolen blanket from his saddle roll around her shoulders. Her body was a block of ice against his. The outlaw had become a savior, and the preacher's daughter was now in the care of a killer. Their paths, once parallel in their misery, had finally, violently crossed. He led them to his camp, a place so well hidden it seemed a part of the landscape itself. It was a shallow cave tucked behind a curtain of ancient junipers, its mouth invisible from more than 20 feet away. Inside, a small, smokeless fire was burning, its warmth a miracle. Alara drifted in and out of a fevered consciousness for what felt like days. In her lucid moments, she was aware of Silas tending to her. He'd lift her head, pressing a cup of hot, savory broth to her lips. He covered her with his own thick bedroll, taking the colder watches by the fire himself. His movements were rough but efficient, the care clinical rather than compassionate, yet it was care all the same. In her fever, the walls of her mind crumbled. She was back in the church, her father's voice booming. She was in the meadow with Nathaniel, his laughter warm in the summer air. She murmured his name, the sound a soft, pained sigh. Silas heard it, his expression unreadable in the firelight, but said nothing. When the fever finally broke, she woke to find him sitting across the fire, cleaning his pistol, the metallic clicks echoing softly in the cave. They had their first real conversation then. She told him who she was, not with the shame her father had tried to brand her with, but with the quiet dignity of a survivor. She told him of Providence, of her father's cold piety, and the town that had turned its back on her. My father. He preaches of God's love, but I don't think he's ever felt it, she said, her voice still weak. Silas looked up from his work, his gray eyes meeting hers. Religion's a fine cloak for a cold heart, he said. I've seen it before. There was a world of experience in that simple statement. She gathered her courage and asked him the question that had been hovering between them. Why are you fighting him? Thorn? He was quiet for a long moment, the only sound the crackle of the fire. He took something from me, he said finally, his voice low and hard. I aim to take it back. The words were deliberately vague, a locked door she knew not to push on. He looked at her, at the fragile strength in her eyes, and seemed to come to a decision. You can ride with me till the next real town, he said, his tone all business. It's safer for you, and a woman traveling with a man draws less notice than one traveling alone. It's a temporary arrangement, for mutual safety. Alara nodded. A temporary arrangement, mutual safety. He was a man who dealt in practicalities, not charity. But as she looked at him across the flickering flames, this grim, haunted outlaw who had twice saved her life, she understood that their survival was now inextricably linked. Back in Providence, the facade of pious tranquility was beginning to crack. Reverend Theron Vance sat in his study, the room dark and opulent with mahogany and leather-bound books that spoke more of status than of study. Across from him, nursing a glass of brandy, sat Bartholomew Thorn. Thorn was not a man accustomed to frustration. He was large and florid, his expensive suit stretched tight across his broad shoulders. He slammed the glass down on the polished desk. 2 more of my men are dead, Vance, he boomed. Found them in the snow north of the pass. It was Kane. It had to be. Word is the bastard's back in the territory. Thorn was seething. He believed Silas Kane was a common train robber, a nuisance threatening his railroad payrolls. The Reverend remained composed, steepling his fingers. Men like Kane are a plague. The Lord will see him dealt with. The Lord seems to be taking his time, Thorn retorted, and that's not the worst of it. He leaned forward, his eyes narrowed. My men. Before Kane got to them, they found someone, a girl, alone in the snow, pregnant. The Reverend's carefully constructed composure fractured. A muscle twitched in his jaw. "A girl?" he asked, his voice dangerously quiet. "Fits the description of your daughter," Thorne said, a cruel smile playing on his lips. He enjoyed seeing the pious preacher squirm. "Seems your little problem didn't have the good sense to die quietly in the wilderness. And now she's running with my big problem. And I, Reverend, do not like loose ends." The blood drained from the Reverend's face. Alara alive, with an outlaw, a notorious killer. The implications were catastrophic. A living, breathing witness to his cruelty, now allied with a man who could protect her. The story she could tell would shatter the reputation he had spent a lifetime building. His fear, cold and sharp, quickly hardened into rage. "She must be brought back," the Reverend declared, his voice regaining its steel. "She is a lost sheep, and it is my duty as her father to guide her back to the fold." Thorne let out a short, ugly laugh. "Oh, is that what it is? The fold?" He didn't care about the preacher's motivations, only the outcome. "Fine, I'm putting a bounty on Kane's head. $1,000, dead or alive. It'll bring every hunter in the territory sniffing around. We can add a bonus for the girl, for her safe return." The way he said it made the words sound like a threat. "Yes," the Reverend agreed, his mind racing. He saw the path forward. He would use Thorne's muscle to achieve his own end. He would frame it as a father's desperate love, a narrative the town would readily accept. But in the cold, dark chambers of his heart, he knew the truth. He wanted Alara back under his control, silenced, her story buried forever, along with the memory of Nathaniel. "I can provide you with information," he offered, his voice smooth as polished stone. "Maps of the old mining trails, the abandoned homesteads. Places a desperate girl might seek shelter." He was signing his daughter's death warrant, cloaking it in the language of salvation. Their next stop was the sheriff's office. Sheriff Brody was a man weathered by 30 years of trying to keep the peace in a lawless land. He was fundamentally decent, but that decency had been worn thin by the constant pressure exerted by the town's two most powerful men, Vance with his moral authority and Thorne with his financial might. Thorne tossed the freshly printed bounty poster onto Brody's desk. It featured a grim, stylized drawing of Silas Kane. Brody read it, his face impassive. Then he read the addendum Thorne had insisted on. $100 bonus for the safe return of Alara Vance to her father, the Reverend Theron Vance of Providence. Brody looked from the poster to the two men standing before him. He remembered the Sunday sermon, the public shaming. He'd found it distasteful, but had held his tongue. Now this sudden, desperate need to retrieve the girl reeked of something more than fatherly concern. It smelled like hypocrisy. It smelled like fear. $1,000 will bring a lot of trouble down on this county, Bart, Brody said, his voice tired. Bounty hunters ain't known for their restraint. It's Kane who's the trouble, Thorne snapped. And this is how we solve it. You will post this in your office and in the town square. It's the law. Brody knew he was trapped. To refuse was to openly defy Thorne, and by extension, the Reverend. It was a career-ending and potentially life-ending move. With a deep sigh, he took the poster and a hammer. He would do his duty. But as he walked outside to nail the notice to the public board, the lie of it settled like a stone in his gut. He was no longer a keeper of the peace. He was an errand boy for a tyrant and a hypocrite. He was now part of the hunt. Silas knew of a place where ghosts could walk unnoticed. He led Alara to Last Chance Creek, a town that had died once the gold vein ran dry. It wasn't entirely empty. A few stubborn prospectors, families too poor or too stubborn to leave, still clung to life in the ramshackle cabins that lined the muddy, forgotten street. It was a place off every map, beneath the notice of men like Thorne. It was a place to disappear. They took possession of a small, abandoned cabin at the edge of the settlement. It was little more than 4 walls and a roof, but after weeks in the wilderness, it felt like a palace. The journey had forged a strange and silent bond between them. The harsh realities of survival had stripped away pretense, leaving only a raw, mutual dependency. In the relative safety of the town, their dynamic began to evolve. Silas, the solitary hunter, found himself in the unfamiliar role of a teacher. He showed Alara how to properly load and clean the pistol he'd given her. "I don't want you to ever have to use it," he'd said, his voice gruff. "But I want you to know how. The world doesn't care if you're a woman or if you're carrying a child. It only cares if you're a victim." He taught her how to read tracks in the dirt, how to tell the age of a campfire, how to move through the woods without making a sound. These were the lessons of his world, the grim scripture of survival. In return, Alara brought a quiet order to the chaos of his life. She took the bleak cabin and, with a few meager supplies from the town's general store, transformed it into a home. She cooked proper meals, the smell of baking bread a startlingly domestic scent in the outlaw's life. She mended the tears in his shirt with neat, careful stitches. She didn't pry or push, but she talked to him. She told him stories of her mother, of books she had read, of a life before her fall. Her presence was a steady, calming influence, slowly chipping away at the thick wall of cynical ice he had built around his heart. One afternoon, while buying flour at the general store, Alara saw it. Nailed to the wall behind the counter was a familiar, dreaded piece of paper. The bounty poster. Her blood ran cold. The grim drawing of Silas looked like a death mask, and there, beneath his name, was hers. $100 bonus for information leading to the return of Alara Vance. The shopkeeper, a kind-faced woman in her 50s named Martha, saw the terror in Alara's eyes. She had seen the way Silas looked after the pregnant young woman, and had drawn her own conclusions, choosing compassion over suspicion. "Don't you mind that," Martha said, her voice a low, conspiratorial whisper. "No one in Last Chance Creek would turn in a man who keeps to himself and pays his way." She leaned closer. "But you be careful. Thorne's money has drawn some nasty flies. Bounty hunters been sniffing around the territory, asking questions." The threat was no longer a distant storm. It was on their doorstep. That night, the cabin felt smaller, the shadows deeper. Alara confronted Silas, her voice trembling as she told him about the poster. He shrugged it off with a practiced nonchalance. "Bounties are a fact of life." "This is different," she insisted, her fear making her bold. "My name is on it. I'm putting you in more danger just by being here. Why don't you run? Go to Mexico. You could disappear." He was silent for a long time, staring into the fire, the flames dancing in his gray eyes. The ghosts were close tonight. "Running doesn't solve anything," he said, his voice rough with an old pain. "I tried that." He finally looked at her, and the door he had kept so tightly locked opened. Just a crack. "I wasn't always this," he said, gesturing vaguely at his gun belt. "I had a ranch. Over in the next valley, a wife, Sarah. A son, Jacob." He spoke of it in short, clipped sentences, as if the words themselves were shards of glass. Thorne wanted his land. Not for the grazing, but for the river that ran through it. Water rights were more valuable than gold. Silas refused to sell. "So Thorne sent his men," Silas continued, his voice devoid of emotion. "They were supposed to just scare us. They set a fire in the barn, a warning. But the wind was high that night. The fire jumped to the house. It all happened so fast." He stopped, his jaw tight. He didn't need to finish the story. The empty desolation in his eyes told the rest. "The something Thorne took from me," he said, his voice a raw whisper. "It wasn't just land." Alara finally understood. His war with Thorne wasn't about vengeance. Vengeance was too simple a word. It was about a debt that could never be repaid, a hollow space in the world that he was trying to fill with justice, one bullet at a time. She looked at this broken, dangerous man, and for the first time, she didn't see an outlaw. She saw a fellow survivor, a man whose heart had been burned out just as surely as his home. Their fragile alliance was no longer one of convenience. It was an alliance of shared grief, forged in the fires of a common enemy. The nasty flies Martha had warned of arrived 2 days later. They were a trio of bounty hunters drawn from the Dakota Badlands by the scent of Thorne's $1,000 bounty. Their leader was a man named Jed, his face a road map of knife scars, and his eyes as cold and dead as a winter snake's. They were not Thorne's usual thugs. They were professionals in the business of human misery. They rode into Last Chance Creek not with a bang, but with a slow, creeping menace. They didn't have to ask many questions. A town this small, sheltering a reclusive man and a pregnant woman? The math was simple. They decided to soften up the town first, to let fear do their work for them. They chose Martha's General Store as their stage. Jed and his men swaggered in, knocking over a barrel of apples and cornering the old woman behind her counter. "We're looking for a friend," Jed said, his voice a parody of politeness as he picked an apple from the floor and took a loud bite. "Goes by the name of Kane. Heard he might have passed through here. With a lady friend." Martha's face was pale, but her chin was firm. "We don't get many strangers." Jed's smile was ugly. He leaned in close, his breath smelling of rot-gut whiskey. "Now, old woman, I think you're lying. And I hate liars." He drew his pistol and laid it on the counter with a loud thud. "Let's try again." Silas had been on his way out of town to scout the ridges. He saw the bounty hunter's horses outside the store and knew immediately what was happening. The old Silas, the solitary ghost, would have cursed his luck and slipped away into the trees. His fight was with Thorne, not with every piece of human refuse Thorne's money attracted. But as he watched Jed menace the old woman who had shown Alara kindness, something shifted inside him. He saw the ghost of his wife, Sarah, cornered and afraid. He heard the echo of his own failure to protect the innocent. This was not Thorne, but it was Thorne's poison seeping into the world. He could not walk away. Not this time. Alara's presence, her quiet courage, had rekindled a part of him he thought was long dead. He stepped out from behind the water trough, his duster sweeping back from his hips. "Leave the woman alone," he said, his voice calm and carrying in the tense silence. "Your business is with me." Jed turned, his scarred face breaking into a wide, predatory grin. He had flushed his quarry. "Kane, I knew you didn't have the sense to run." His eyes flickered past Silas, toward the cabin at the edge of town. "We'll get to you, but Thorne said bring the girl back too, and the Reverend pays extra if she's unharmed." He chuckled, a low, nasty sound. "Doesn't say we can't have some fun with her first." That was it, the final line. The casual, bragging cruelty of it lit a fuse in Silas. The world exploded into motion. Jed went for his gun, but Silas was a blur. His Colt was in his hand, barking before Jed's had even cleared its holster. The bounty hunter was slammed back against the counter, a look of shock on his face. The other two opened fire, their shots tearing splinters from the storefronts. Silas was already diving behind a stack of barrels, the world dissolving into a chaotic symphony of gunfire and shouting. He was outnumbered, but this was his element. He moved with a predator's grace, using the town's layout, every corner and shadow to his advantage. Back in the cabin, Alara heard the first shot. Her heart leaped into her throat. She ran to the window and saw it all. Silas pinned down, the two remaining hunters advancing on his position. Her first instinct was terror, a primal urge to hide, to protect the life inside her. But then Jed's vile words echoed in her mind. "Doesn't say we can't have some fun with her first." This wasn't just Silas's fight. They were hunting her too. The pistol he had given her was on the table. Her hands were shaking so violently she could barely pick it up. The weapon felt heavy, alien. The world only cares if you're a victim. She would not be a victim. Her hands steadied. Her fear was still there, a cold knot in her stomach, but it was now overlaid with a diamond-hard layer of resolve. She wouldn't be a liability. She would be a partner. She moved to the doorway of the cabin, which offered a clear line of sight to the flank of one of the hunters. He was creeping along the side of the blacksmith shop, getting a bead on Silas's position. He was focused, confident, unaware of the new threat. Alara raised the pistol with both hands, just as Silas had taught her. She lined up the sight, her breath held tight in her chest. She wasn't aiming to kill. She was aiming to help. She squeezed the trigger. The gun kicked, the sound deafening. Her shot was wild, nowhere near the man, but it slammed into the wooden wall just inches from his head. The impact sent splinters flying into his face. He yelped in surprise and pain, flinching back, his own shot going wide. That single second of distraction was all Silas needed. He rose from behind the barrels, his Colt steady, and fired twice. The hunter fell. The last one, seeing he was alone, made a desperate run for his horse. Silas's final shot was calm, measured, and ended the fight for good. Silence descended on Last Chance Creek, broken only by the whimpering of the wind and the frantic beating of Alara's heart. She was still standing in the doorway, the pistol smoking in her hand. Silas looked over at her, his face unreadable. Then, the people of Last Chance Creek, who had been hiding in their homes, began to emerge. They came out slowly, holding old rifles and shotguns, their faces a mixture of fear and dawning respect. Martha was the first to approach Silas. "Thank you," she said, her voice trembling but firm. Silas just gave a curt nod, uncomfortable with the gratitude. But as he looked from the grateful townspeople to Alara, standing tall in the doorway of their cabin, a protector in her own right, he felt something he hadn't felt since the fire. It was a fragile, unfamiliar flicker of hope. They had made a stand, and they had won. In the aftermath of the gunfight, the atmosphere in Last Chance Creek had changed. The fear that had clung to the town like a shroud was replaced by a defiant, communal spirit. Silas was no longer just a mysterious outsider. He was their protector. They approached him not with suspicion, but with offers of food, fresh water, and ammunition. He accepted it all with a gruff reluctance, unused to being seen as a hero. Alara, however, accepted their gratitude with a quiet grace. She helped Martha clean up the store, her calm presence a balm on the town's frayed nerves. She was no longer just the pregnant girl Silas was protecting. She was a part of their small, battered community. In this forgotten corner of the world, she had found something she never had in the pious halls of Providence: acceptance. Later that evening, while they were sorting through the belongings of the dead bounty hunters, Silas found it. Tucked inside Jed's saddlebag was a folded, oilskin-wrapped letter. It was from Bart Thorne. The first part was a formal, typed contract detailing the terms of the bounty on Silas Kane. But it was the handwritten addendum at the bottom, scrawled in a different, more elegant hand that made Silas's blood run cold. He recognized the handwriting from the wanted poster. It was the Reverend's. Addendum. Regarding the girl, Alara. Her safe return is the preferred outcome for public appearance. However, the situation is delicate. If she cannot be retrieved quietly without drawing undue attention, then you are authorized to ensure the matter is concluded permanently. A fall from a horse, a stray bullet during the apprehension of Kane, an accident. Be discreet. I want this entire unfortunate ordeal concluded. It was a murder contract, signed, sealed, and delivered by her own father. Silas felt a cold rage settle in his gut. He had known the preacher was a hypocrite, but this was a different level of evil. He took the letter back to the cabin. Alara was by the fire, mending a tear in his coat. He watched her for a moment, the picture of quiet domesticity, and his heart ached for the violence he was about to bring back into her life. He handed her the letter without a word. She read it once, then twice, her face growing paler with each line. The clinical, dismissive language, unfortunate ordeal, was like a physical blow. Any lingering filial hope she might have harbored that her father's cruelty had its limits was utterly annihilated. He didn't just want her gone, he wanted her erased. "He wants me dead," she whispered, the words barely audible. The letter trembled in her hand, and then, like a key turning in a long rusted lock, everything clicked into place. "Nathaniel," she breathed, her eyes wide with a dawning, soul-crushing horror. She looked at Silas, her expression pleading with him to deny what she was about to say. "My father. He hated that I was seeing him. He called him dirt. Nathaniel stood up to him, told him he loved me, that he would marry me with or without his blessing." She remembered the last time she saw him. He had been so full of hope, so certain they could build a life together. Then he was gone. "Run off to find work," they said. "He didn't just run him off," she said, the tears she had held back for so long finally breaking free, tracing paths through the grime on her cheeks. "Oh, God. He couldn't have." But she knew he could. She knew he would. Her father, the righteous Reverend Vance, had found his daughter's choice of suitor inconvenient, and he had turned to the town's other power, the ruthless Bart Thorne, to have the problem dealt with. Her banishment wasn't just about the shame of her pregnancy, it was about burying his first and greatest sin. The grief that washed over her was immense, a tidal wave of pain for Nathaniel, for their lost future, for the child who would now never know its father. But as the wave receded, it left behind something hard and unyielding. Her sorrow began to calcify into a cold, diamond-hard resolve. She wiped her eyes, her hand steady now. She looked at Silas, her gaze clear and direct. The girl he had found shivering in the snow was gone. In her place was a woman forged in betrayal and grief. "We can't run anymore," she said, her voice low and firm. "Running is what he wants. He'll hunt us to the ends of the earth to protect his secret. I'm going back to Providence." "That's suicide," Silas said, his voice flat. "No," she countered, her eyes flashing with a cold fire. "It's a reckoning. My father built his house on lies and bones. I'm going to be the one who tears it down. I will face him, with you or without you." Silas looked at her, at the unbreakable strength that had bloomed from her pain. He saw the parallel, the perfect, terrible symmetry of their lives. Vance and Thorne, the preacher and the baron, two powerful men who destroyed anyone who got in the way of what they wanted. Her fight was his fight. His quest for vengeance against Thorne and her quest for justice for Nathaniel were two rivers flowing to the same sea. A slow, grim smile touched his lips. He picked up his gun belt from the table. "All right, preacher's girl," he said, the name no longer an insult but a term of respect. "Let's go to church." Their departure from Last Chance Creek was different from all their previous flights. They were no longer just running, they were planning a campaign. Silas, embracing his new and unlikely role as a leader, gathered the handful of tough, grizzled prospectors who owed him their lives. "I'm going after Thorne," he told them, his voice resonating with an authority they respected. "Not for bounty, but to cut the head off the snake that's been poisoning this territory for years." He laid out a map on a crate. "I'm not asking you to ride into Providence and fight my war, but I need a diversion. Thorne moves a payroll wagon through Grey Wolf Canyon every Friday. If that wagon were to be hit, he'd have to pull most of his men out of town to deal with it." The prospectors, men with their own long simmering grudges against the land baron who had squeezed them dry, looked at each other. One of them, a wiry old man named Amos, spat a stream of tobacco juice into the dirt. "Thorne run my partner off his claim last year," he growled. "I'll be damned if I don't help you kick his anthill. We'll give you your diversion, Kane." The next part of the plan was more delicate. Silas knew a frontal assault on Providence was folly. They needed an ally on the inside, or at least a neutral party. His thoughts turned to Sheriff Brody. Brody was a man caught in the gears of a corrupt machine, but Silas sensed he wasn't a part of it. He just needed a push. He entrusted Martha with the task. The kindly shopkeeper, her loyalty to Alara and Silas now absolute, rode ahead to Providence under the guise of visiting a cousin. She carried a secret, sealed note. She found Sheriff Brody in his office, looking weary and defeated. She delivered the note and left without a word. Brody broke the seal. The message was short and stark. "Sheriff, I'm coming. I have proof that Thorne and the Reverend conspired to murder Nathaniel Miller, and that the Reverend ordered the death of his own daughter. When the shooting starts, choose a side. Or have the good sense to stay out of the way. S. Kane." Brody read the note 3 times. It confirmed every ugly suspicion he'd had. The proof. If Kane really had proof, then this wasn't just an outlaw coming to town. This was justice arriving on the back of a horse with a gun. He walked over to the wall where the bounty poster was tacked. For a long moment, he stared at the grim drawing of Silas and the innocent-sounding request for Alara's return. He thought of the Reverend's sermons on morality, of Thorne's arrogant swagger. The hypocrisy of it all finally curdled the years of frustrated compromise in his gut. With a sudden, decisive movement, he ripped the poster from the wall, crumpled it into a tight ball, and tossed it into the pot-bellied stove. A small flame licked at the paper, consuming the lies. He wouldn't ride with Silas Kane, but he would be damned if he would ride against him. He walked to his duty roster and began making changes, assigning his one and only deputy to patrol the farthest edge of town for the next 2 days. When the storm broke, the sheriff's office would be officially and pointedly blind. Under the cover of a moonless night, Silas and Alara reached the hills overlooking Providence. The town lights twinkled below, a deceptive picture of peace. To Alara, it looked different now. It was not the home that had cast her out, but a fortress built on secrets, a tomb holding the truth of the man she had loved. She felt no fear, only a cold, clear sense of purpose. They made a hidden camp and watched the town, planning their final moves. Their goals were intertwined, but distinct. Silas, with the ledger he now knew must exist, would dismantle Thorne's criminal empire. He would face the man who had taken everything from him. Alara's battleground would be different. Her target was her father. Her weapon would not be a pistol, but the truth. And she would deploy it on his own hallowed ground at the moment of his greatest public power, his Sunday sermon. Friday came, gray and overcast. 10 miles from Providence, in the narrow, winding passage of Grey Wolf Canyon, Amos and the prospectors from Last Chance Creek lay in wait. They were not bandits, but they had the grim determination of men wronged. When Thorne's heavy payroll wagon, escorted by 6 outriders, rumbled into the canyon, they didn't open fire. They triggered the trap. With a mighty heave on their levers, they sent a cascade of boulders and scree tumbling down the canyon wall. The rockslide, a thunderous roar of geological violence, completely blocked the path ahead of the wagon. The lead horses reared in terror. The guards, confused and panicked, drew their weapons, firing wildly at the cliffs. From the other side, Amos and his men opened fire, not to kill, but to create maximum chaos. The plan worked better than Silas could have hoped. The surviving guards galloped back to Providence, their story growing more embellished with every mile. It wasn't a few disgruntled miners, it was a full-scale ambush by a private army. Bart Thorne, his face purple with rage, bought the story hook, line, and sinker. Kane was making a direct play for his fortune. Leaving only a skeleton crew to guard the town and his personal interests, Thorne gathered every man he could find and rode furiously toward the canyon, straight into the diversion. The town of Providence, suddenly drained of its hired muscle, became a ghost of its usual self. Under the cover of the ensuing confusion, Silas and Alara slipped into the streets they both knew so well. At the edge of the town square, they paused. Thorne keeps his books in his office, above the saloon, Silas said, his voice a low whisper. He's arrogant. He'll have everything written down. I'll get the ledger. It's the proof we need. Alara nodded, pulling the hood of her cloak further over her face. I know where I need to go. They looked at each other for a moment, a silent acknowledgement of the precipice they stood on. Then they separated, 2 ghosts with a singular purpose, melting into the shadows of the town that had wronged them. Silas moved with a deadly grace through the back alleys, his senses on high alert. Alara walked through the main streets, a hooded and anonymous figure. Every building, every corner held a memory. There was the bakery where her mother used to buy her sweets, the mercantile where she'd first seen Nathaniel. The memories didn't hurt anymore. They were fuel. She arrived at her destination, the Providence Community Church. The great oak doors that had been slammed shut on her were now unlocked, awaiting the Sunday flock. She pushed one open and slipped inside. The air was cold and still, thick with the scent of old wood and incense. Light filtered through the stained glass windows, painting the empty pews in jewel-toned colors. It was a beautiful lie. She walked down the central aisle, her soft boots making no sound on the stone floor. She stopped at the pulpit, the very spot where her father had performed her social execution. She ran her hand over the polished carved wood. This was his throne, the source of his power, and it would be the stage for his downfall. With a final deep breath, she turned and made her way to a small hidden door that led to the narrow, winding stairs of the bell tower. There, hidden in the shadows, with a view of the entire church, she would wait. She would wait for Sunday. She would wait for the reckoning. The saloon was quiet, the usual raucous energy bled out of it by Thorne's furious departure. Silas slipped through a back window, his movements silent as a cat's. He made his way up the private staircase to Thorne's office. The door was locked, but the cheap lock was no match for the knife and bit of wire he carried. A few moments of deft work, and the lock clicked open. Thorne's office was like the man himself, ostentatious and bloated. A massive oak desk dominated the room, and the walls were covered in maps of the territory, with huge swaths of land marked in red ink. Thorne's acquisitions. Silas didn't waste time. He went straight for the desk. In the bottom drawer, under a false bottom, he found it. A thick leather-bound ledger. He flipped it open. It was all there, recorded in Thorne's arrogant, looping script. Illegal land seizures, extortion rackets, intimidation payments. And then he found the section he was looking for. Under Pastoral Services and Community Outreach, a sickeningly cynical heading, were a series of coded payments to Reverend Theron Vance. Silas's eyes narrowed as he saw one entry in particular, a very large sum paid out just days after Nathaniel Miller had supposedly left town. He had the proof. But Thorne was arrogant, not stupid. As Silas turned to leave, the office door burst open. Two of Thorne's guards, men he'd left behind specifically to protect his sanctum, stood there, pistols drawn. The office exploded in a cacophony of gunfire. Silas dove behind the massive desk, the wood splintering as bullets slammed into it. He came up firing, his Colt bucking in his hand. One guard grunted and fell, clutching his shoulder. The other ducked back into the hallway. What followed was not a clean duel, but a brutal, close-quarters fight. Silas kicked the desk over for better cover and fought his way out of the office and down the stairs, the remaining guard firing from the landing above. Patrons in the saloon below screamed and scattered. Glass shattered. Silas slid across the bar, whiskey bottles exploding around him, and fired up at the landing. The guard fell with a cry, tumbling down the stairs to land in a heap. Silas stood, breathing heavily, the ledger tucked securely inside his coat. He was about to make his escape when the main doors of the saloon were thrown open with a violent crash. Bart Thorne stood there, his face a mask of thunderous rage. The raid in the canyon had been too easy, the resistance too quick to fold. His instincts had screamed that it was a feint. He had returned to find his worst fears realized. He saw the dead guards, the wrecked saloon, and Silas Kane standing there. The victor. "Kane!" Thorne roared, his pistol already in his hand. "That book is my property!" "This book is your tombstone," Silas snarled back, his own gun rising to meet Thorne's. "And you bought the plot when you burned down my ranch." The final confrontation was not a quick draw at high noon. It was a desperate, ugly battle through the wreckage of the saloon. Thorne was a big man, strong and fueled by a cornered animal's rage. He kicked over tables, using them as shields, his shots tearing huge chunks out of the bar. But Silas was fighting for more than just vengeance now. He was fighting for the ghosts of his wife and son, for the quiet courage of the woman waiting in the church, for a future he hadn't dared to imagine until a few weeks ago. He moved with a purpose that was colder and sharper than Thorne's rage. He flanked Thorne, forcing him out from behind cover. For a moment, they stood 20 feet apart, the air thick with smoke and the smell of spilled liquor. Both men fired. Thorne's shot went wide, shattering the large mirror behind the bar. Silas's did not. Thorne looked down at his chest, a dark stain blossoming on his white shirt. He looked up at Silas, his expression one of pure disbelief. He opened his mouth to speak, but only a gurgle came out. He staggered backward, crashed into a table, and fell to the floor, his reign of terror over. Silas stood over him for a long moment, the smoke curling from his pistol. He felt no triumph, no satisfaction, only a vast, quiet emptiness. The ghosts were silent. He turned, the ledger a heavy weight inside his coat, and walked out into the pale morning light, leaving the dead man in his ruined palace. Sunday morning dawned bright and clear. The news of Bart Thorne's death and the shootout at the saloon had spread through Providence like wildfire. The town was buzzing with a mixture of fear and exhilarated speculation. The church was more packed than it had been in years. They had come seeking answers, reassurance, and, most of all, a spectacle. Reverend Theron Vance strode to the pulpit, his face a mask of solemn, commanding authority. He saw the chaos as an opportunity. In times of fear, people craved a firm hand, a strong voice to tell them what to think. He would be that voice. He would preach about the evils of violence, the sin that had visited their town, and in doing so, he would subtly reassert his own position as the unassailable moral center of Providence. He began his sermon, his magnificent voice filling the nave. "We gather this morning in the shadow of darkness," he boomed. "Violence has visited our peaceful community. A man lies dead. This is the fruit of a lawless life. The wages of sin is death." He was building to his crescendo, the congregation hanging on his every word, when the great church doors at the back of the nave swung open with a loud creak. Every head turned. Framed in the bright morning light stood the silhouette of Silas Kane. He was bruised, his clothes were torn, but he stood tall, his presence radiating a dangerous calm. In his hand he held a thick, leather-bound book. The congregation gasped. A murmur of shock and fear swept through the pews. Before the Reverend could find his voice to condemn the intrusion, another voice called out, clear and strong, not from the back of the church, but from above. "He speaks of sin," the voice declared, ringing with an eerie, amplified clarity in the church's acoustics. "Let him speak of his own." All eyes lifted toward the choir loft. A figure stepped out of the shadows. It was Alara. She was no longer the broken, shamed girl they had watched be cast out. The months in the wilderness had stripped away her youthful softness, replacing it with a hard-won strength. Her pregnancy, once the symbol of her shame, was now a defiant testament to her survival. She looked like an avenging angel returned to the scene of her condemnation. The Reverend stared, his mouth agape, his face turning the color of ash. "Ilara?" he whispered, the name a strangled horror. She ignored him, her eyes sweeping over the stunned faces of the congregation. "You all sat here in this very church and watched my father cast me out for my sin?" she began, her voice trembling not with weakness, but with suppressed fury. "You listened to his words of righteousness and you nodded. Now you will listen to the truth." She told them everything. She spoke of her love for Nathaniel Miller, a good and gentle man. She spoke of her father's venomous disapproval. And then her voice rose, filled with a righteous power that eclipsed her father's theatrical boom. "My father told you Nathaniel left town. That is a lie," she declared. She pulled the folded letter from her cloak, Thorne's letter, with her father's handwritten death warrant upon it. "This is a letter from Bart Thorne to the bounty hunter he hired. But this," she pointed to the bottom of the page, "this is my father's handwriting. An order to have me killed if I could not be brought back quietly. An accident," he called it. A collective gasp went through the church. Alara pressed on, her voice breaking with the raw pain of her revelation. "Why would he want me dead? Because my child is the living proof of his first murder. He hated Nathaniel. He saw him as an obstacle, so he used his friend, the man who now lies dead in the saloon, to remove him." At that moment, Silas began to walk slowly down the center aisle, his boots echoing on the stone floor. He didn't say a word. He simply walked to the altar and slapped the ledger down upon it. The sound was like a gunshot in the silent church. "The proof is in that book," Alara's voice rang out. "Payments from Thorne to my father, a large one right after Nathaniel disappeared. He didn't banish me for my sin. He banished me to hide his, the murder of the man I loved and the father of my child." All eyes, 100 pairs of them, turned from the defiant woman in the loft to the ledger on the altar, and finally to the man at the pulpit. Reverend Vance's mask of piety had shattered, revealing the terrified, cornered animal beneath. He stammered, his hands gripping the lectern that had always been his source of power. "Lies! These are the devil's lies! She is a fallen woman! He is a killer!" But his words were hollow, his authority gone. The evidence was overwhelming, the truth undeniable in Alara's raw, honest grief. Sheriff Brody, who had been standing quietly at the back of the church, began to walk forward, his face grim, his hand resting on the butt of his pistol. He wasn't walking toward Silas. He was walking toward the altar. The spell was broken. The town of Providence, which had for so long been held captive by the Reverend's moral tyranny, was finally free. The reckoning, when it came, was not one of fire and brimstone. There were no shouts of condemnation, no calls for a rope. There was only a profound, damning silence. One by one, family by family, the people of Providence stood up from their pews. They did not look at Alara or Silas. They looked at the man at the pulpit, their faces filled with a mixture of disgust, pity, and shame for their own complicity. And then, without a word, they turned and walked out of the church. The sound of their footsteps was a funeral march for the Reverend's life. He watched them go, his congregation, his flock, his source of power, abandoning him until he was utterly and completely alone in the vast, silent hall he had ruled for so long. He was a king with no kingdom, a shepherd with no sheep. He collapsed onto the steps of his own altar, a broken, pathetic man finally crushed under the weight of his own sins. Sheriff Brody stopped, looked at the sobbing figure, then at Silas. Brody simply nodded, a gesture of grim understanding, before turning and following the last of the townsfolk out into the bright sunlight. Justice had been served. Spring came to the valley, a season of impossible rebirth. The snows melted, feeding the thirsty earth, and the hillsides erupted in a riot of green shoots and wildflowers. The air was warm, filled with the scent of pine and damp soil. On a gentle slope overlooking a clear, fast-running river, a new cabin stood, its raw pines smelling fresh and clean. It stood on the land that had once belonged to Silas's family. From the porch, Alara watched Silas mend a fence line. He moved with a new ease, the haunted, hunted look gone from his eyes. He was no longer a ghost. He was a builder. In her arms, she held her son, a beautiful, healthy baby with a tuft of dark hair and his mother's calm, intelligent eyes. She had named him Nathaniel. The sound of an approaching horse made her look up. It was Sheriff Brody, but he wasn't wearing his gun belt. He dismounted and approached the porch, holding his hat in his hands. "Ilara, Lilas," he said with a neighborly nod. "Just came from the telegraph office. Word from the territorial marshal. Thorne's ledger told them everything they needed to know. They're closing the book on all of it." He looked directly at Silas. "Including you. Your bounties have been rescinded. Your name is cleared. They ruled your actions in the matter of Thorne and his men as self-defense and in the service of public good." Silas walked up to the porch, wiping his hands on his trousers. He looked at Brody, then at Alara and their son. A slow smile spread across his face, a genuine smile that reached his eyes, chasing away the last of the shadows. He was a free man. After the sheriff left, Silas came and stood behind Alara, his hands resting on her shoulders. They stood together, looking out over their land, their child cradled safely between them. They had faced down the demons of the past, the hypocrisy of powerful men, and the brutality of the wilderness. In the process, this pregnant preacher's daughter and this haunted outlaw cowboy had become each other's salvation. The future was a vast, unwritten territory, as wild and uncertain as the land around them. But for the first time, it was theirs to write together. They were the heart of a new community, a true providence, built not on the cold stone of judgment, but on the rich soil of resilience, truth, and grace.